what phase of this fight are we in? And what is the next phase? So, James and Christopher, both of you guys, I've seen you put in the legwork, the foundation work to set up the machine that you guys have built, to set up all the balls that are in motion. Now they're in motion. Things are happening. So at this point, it's like, okay, this storyline, as it were, is going to continue to play out. What is the next phase? After maybe we get some more success in policy, maybe there's more awareness on theory and what it really means. We get people to say the words out loud of what it really is. What comes after that? Because there's going to have to be a next phase. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about that, where you see this going, and what are your thoughts on where we are on this in a year or 2 or 3 or 5? James?
Well, I mean, that's a tall order, but I would actually say that if we were to draw a World War II metaphor, that D-Day has occurred. We have taken the beach. We have established a front, but we have certainly not won the war. In fact, we haven't taken back much territory, but we have established a beachhead. We have established a front to fight this war. It's very actually helpful to think of this as a sort of world war that's being fought on a cultural level rather than being fought with guns. And we are at that kind of position. Now, having established the front does not guarantee victory. But this is what I started to say before we kind of segued, just to touch on it, is the fact that, people are doing substantive work is where all of this is going to matter. So what I see going forward as far as the next phase is, the stuff that's happening now has to continue. We have to keep laying out enough of the theory so people can cure the disease through understanding rather than kind of blindly. We also have to keep doing the substantive institutional kind of, if to call it that, work that Chris is spearheading so effectively, where we're getting the legal changes. We're getting lawsuits filed around those legal changes. We're getting people showing up and trying to take back actual institutions. It's not going to be enough to rip every kid out of school parents don't like this. We're actually going to have to try to get some institutional footing back. And so those things need to be continuing. That said, what we also have to do, and this is where what you just said about your own work, Jack, is really helpful. We have to understand that the left, the dialectical left, I'll be very specific about which left I mean. The dialectical left, if we might call the woke and the communists kind of collectively by that name, are extremely good at taking any institutional change that you possibly can think of or make and then twisting it back around to their advantage. So these institutional changes that are absolutely necessary, they must continue, are only one part of a bigger story. And the cultural change where we start, whether it's waking people up and teaching them how to live in this environment, reinstilling proper values that forward things like truth and beauty and excellence and liberty and responsibility, the kind of anti-woke merit, caring about competence, the kind of anti-woke litany of values. That cultural change is going to be a big one. So this is a thing that I've just started in the past month or so. I did it in my Tampa workshop I had last week, and I gave a couple of little talks about it. I even mentioned it at Turning Point, but I think the audience wasn't the right audience for it. But is it, we have to start cultivating what we might call a common sensibility. And I think this is extremely important. A common sensibility about what is sensible in life again. Right now, the intersectional sensibility, which Marcuse kind of predicted with his new sensibility in the essay on liberation that he talked about, the intersectional sensibility that we are currently shifting into, what Wesleyan calls the successor ideology on the ground, is thinking about identity and thinking about power dynamics in terms of everything. You don't know if something is true or false until you know who said it and what skin color they have. You don't know if something was good or bad until you know what skin color the person has. This is what we're going to do, the critical race Bill de Blasio, who's now going to literally institute a Jim Crow policy because minorities have the lowest vaccination rates in New York City. But hey, screw it. Let's just exclude them from society anyway. That's a critical race analysis that will come sooner or later when they stop milking power out of the vaccine passports. So what we have to do is we have to get out of this fractured intersectional identity balkanized sensibility where who you are in relationship to so-called systems of power means everything. And we have to get back to a common sensibility. And that's where those values, truth, excellence is for everybody. Truth is for everybody. That's the definition of truth is it doesn't matter who says it. It's still true. Excellence is for everybody. Merit is something anybody can aspire to and achieve. Responsibility is something literally anybody can take to climb their way out of dependency. So getting back to a common sensibility where we see the world on common terms, we understand ourselves in common language. We don't have this crazy nonsense jargon and, manipulated language where diversity doesn't mean diversity, means conformity, and inclusion actually means exclusion of people you don't want there. Like, we have to get back to a common ground, when I'm saying a common sensibility and kind of direct refutation of Marcuse, which, by the way, Kimberly Crenshaw, in her paper, Mapping the Margins Even, and many times since, has referred to intersectionality. She says it's not so much a theory, it's more of a sensibility. It's more of a sensibility. Marcuse is saying we need a new sensibility if we're going to get liberation. In other words, communism, of his new neo-Marxist flavor of communism. And so, no, direct refutation of that. We're going to have a common sensibility in the United States and throughout the West, and hopefully broader throughout the world, where we understand one another as human beings who are interested in truth, who flourish through excellence, who where merit matters and minimizes corruption. We're taking responsibility is seen as a path to exiting dependency rather than smashing the system that you believe is making you dependent, when you could actually just take that individual action yourself. These common sense, common sensibility type mentalities, I think that's a huge next phase, because if we shift the culture and we learn, as you said, how to live in this stupid environment, and we shift the culture, then these institutional changes get solid legs under them. So the laws stick. The laws mean something. The jurisprudence that follows them is sensible, again, in a way that keeps them from being twisted around by this dialectical evil that we're having to deal with.
Chris, what do you see as the next phase here, or comments on that? You know how it works. Chris, floor is yours. Go.
Yeah, I agree with James. I think the common sensibility is important, and I think it also requires us to have a common sensibility about the country. What is the purpose of the country? What are the kind of principles of the country? Where do we want the country to go? And I think that that is going to be very difficult to do, but I think is ultimately very important. And I think if we're to take the critiques of critical race theory seriously, and I think we should, I mean, it's not all terrible. It's not a joke. I mean, some of these criticisms are serious, and some of them are even valid, even if their conclusions are totally invalid. I think we need to figure out, what do we mean by those kind of the tension between freedom and equality? What do we mean by freedom in the 21st century? What do we mean by equality in the 21st century? How do those principles go together? Where do they conflict? Where can they harmonize? And we do need to present a new vision of those principles. We need to renew those timeless principles for our actual specific time and place. So I think there's work to be done there on a sensibility, on a philosophy, on a kind of national identity. But I also think that the next step, at least in my view, something that I'm going to be working on very hard, is how do we reshape institutional power in our country? Because we need to understand that critical race theory is an ideology that is inherently self-contradictory. It's an ideology that is anti-capitalist. It's an ideology that is kind of anti-American in the sense that it wants to subvert the American regime. But it's also an ideology that was really subsidized and continues to be subsidized by taxpayer dollars. It's an ideology that only thrives in public institutions, or institutions like private universities that are showered with public dollars through student loan subsidies and direct grants, etc. So you get to the point where you have the critical race theorists that are invited to federal Department of Education conferences, that work at state-funded university systems, that then implement their ideas in public schools and city government municipal agencies, where you have essentially an ideology that is completely subsidized to the gills by taxpayer money, that opposes the values of the majority of taxpayers and wants to subvert the public institutions in which it is embedded. So I think that we have both a curse and a blessing here. The curse is that these kind of radical minoritarians, philosophical minoritarians, representing a viewpoint, a kind of unpopular viewpoint, and even I should emphasize, Latinos and Asians who have an opinion on critical race theory oppose critical race theory by a 2-to-1 margin. This isn't a simple kind of white and people of color distinction. Actually, every minority group polled, besides African Americans, who are a little bit closer to 50-50, opposes critical race theory by large margins. That's an aside. The main point is that they've taken this ideology that represents a very small fraction of people, and then use public dollars to subsidize it. Well, that's the curse. The blessing is what the public giveth, the public can taketh away. So we need to come out with policies to basically say our public institutions are going to represent the broad values of the public, and we're going to go through and reshape, restructure, and decentralize power, decentralize money, decentralize institutions so that it represents the actual people's viewpoints and priorities, not just these ideologues who've hijacked these institutions. That's going to be if you think our fight so far has been intense, it's going to get much more intense when we start trying to take away their public money.